Hi, this video is more a recap of the previous videos I've made and basically collecting some thoughts before moving on to, the next steps in terms of music production, setups, DAWs, programs, plugins, configurations, working with Pipewire, experimenting around with audio, sound, music theory, etc. Let's go. I think it was 7 months ago where I've probably started my YouTube channel, starting uploading tutorials about music production on Linux. But it was, the first videos were more centralized towards Arch Linux. Being the distro I've been using the most till a few months ago. The reason of me switching to Linux was because I was getting sick and tired of Windows. Even I think a year before the Copilot topic was even a thing, but yeah. And it all started with me, and this entire idea of mine started actually, with wanting to make music, etc. And it was Windows at the time before I've switched. And then again, I've switched to Linux, and then I wanted to figure out, okay, I want to work with Reaper DAW, for example, set things up. How do I do this? And there were some forums in the internet, etc. here and there, but really fragmented around the globe. And getting basic information was not as easy. I mean, there were some YouTube tutorials, but it wasn't not really that something that was clearly explained. For example, I had to figure out how to work with Windows audio plugins inside Linux, that is Yabridge, for example, then working with Wine, etc. For example, the situation with Wine where you need to downgrade Wine in order for it to work. I had, first of all, it broke down, did not work anymore. I was kind of confused why the hell it's no longer working. Figured things out, etc. Checked some internet forums, and it was not really, when you type in Google or Bing or Brave search, whatever, that it's in the first list. No, it was on the 13th, 14th, I don't know where, in some specific line where it was standing in need to downgrade Wine. I mean, yeah, it's kind of my fault too, because on the actual developer website, everything is documented, but who the hell reads the entire documentation? I should have, but yeah, here we are. That's why I always recommend you to check out the developers' websites of specific programs, because obviously they know the best how the program works. And me jumping straight into Arch was definitely an interesting step, because Arch Linux is really known to be a minimal installation. Okay, I was using EndeavorsOS, an Arch derivative, but there were some things pre-installed, it was made a bit easier to use, but all in all, it was still Arch through and through. Now, one might ask, why the hell did you start with an Arch-based Linux distro and not a Debian-based, for example, like Linux Mint or Ubuntu, for example? The reason was, I wanted to have the maximum control, and I was not really that afraid of experimenting around. Arch, being a very terminal-centric Linux distro, was not that big of a problem for me, because on Windows, before I made the switch, I, for example, had a bug in the Microsoft Store. So whenever I wanted to update packages, I did it via the terminal. So I basically was already an Arch user when I was using Windows, more or less. That's a stupid comparison, but yeah, it was not really that great of an experience for me, Windows. Yeah, but back to the actual playlist of mine. And the first videos were really Arch-centric, and it was more flying over the details and giving you, do this, and this, I will explain later on, etc. So I shown you step by step, but I did not properly explain every single step to you. And again, it was very Arch-centric and focused. In the later videos, of course, I have talked about, optimizing your CPU performance, behavior to get the optimal results in terms of audio production, music production, in general. Then working with BudFS, which has directly nothing to do with audio production, but BudFS with the compression tool, with set standard, for example, you can compress files, with which you can compress audio plugins, audio samples, for example, which then you can later on use inside a Linux DAW, etc. And then that how the performance is different by different compression settings compared to the CPU performance. Again, in the playlist everything is explained, etc. So do not be confused. Then yeah, I've talked about installing Linux audio plugins, which is actually pretty self-explanatory, but maybe in which directory the audio plugins, audio DAWs, should search for in order to find these audio plugins, but yeah, it's not really a problem. Then installing Windows audio plugins, a more difficult setup, because you need to work with the proper Wine version, then with the proper Yabridge version, working with Yabridge itself, setting the directives up, etc., scanning them with Yabridge Sync, for example, and then scan it via the DAW, so you can actually use these audio plugins inside your DAW for audio production. Then I was talking about, how performant are they, how stable are they, etc. Then I've also made a video about the differences between virtual machine and containers, for example. Why the hell am I putting these topics in a music playlist, which is directly nothing to do with audio production, is because my entire setup, my audio setup, is running in an Arch Linux container running through DistroBox Pacman successfully inside Fedora. And so in order for you to know what is a container, how it behaves differently than a virtual machine, what are the performance impacts possibly I would have working with a container, a virtual machine, that's what I have explained in this video, for example, in this playlist. Again, if you're curious, I'm doing this setup without any issues, without any problems. A short tangent of mine, a DistroBox container is less of an operating system you install inside another operating system, but it is more an operating system you install in parallel, maybe with slightly lower access to your system, but still more than enough to work flawlessly in it. Again, I've made a video. It probably sounds more confusing the more I try to explain it shortly, but again, it was covered there. Then I've also talked, for example, about bottles. What is bottles? Bottles are wine derivative basically, but made way easier for you, way easier to work with it, and what its benefits are for having separate emulated C drives. Emulated C drives, I'm saying this under exclamation mark because it's not an emulation. Wine is not an emulation. Yeah, it's what its use cases are, its benefits, etc. Also, a really important part of this playlist is the real-time privileges, because audio plugins need to have certain access to your operating system, especially in regards of memory usage, etc. And your operating system by default limits that, because it wants to create stability, blah blah blah. So you need to disable this, or just grant these audio plugins more access to your resources, because you want to have optimal performance, obviously. That's what I also covered in this playlist. And in this playlist I also talked about installing Reaper. Yeah, installing Reaper, it's a pretty easy setup, but installing audio plugins inside Reaper, Reapack for example, with Reapack you can then further on add repositories, Reaper repositories into Reaper DAW, so you can install plugins. So it's basically behaves like a Linux distro repository, but just for the Reaper DAW itself. Yeah, weird comparison, but I do not care. Then I also talked about Pipewire, Pipewire ALSA, Pipewire Pulse, Pipewire Jack. What are these use cases, for example, how it behaves inside the operating system compared to how ASIO for All would behave in Windows, for example. Yeah, it was a oversimplified comparison, but nonetheless, my experience working with both of these here, and how, for example, Pipewire is not necessarily just a music driver, an audio driver, but also for managing MIDI and for managing video. So for example, you can route with it screen recording into OBS, for example. It's amazing tool. So yeah. In the comment section I've read many of your comments, how helpful it was, how difficult the learning curve may be for a new beginner. I completely understand any one of you, because again, it was not that I woke up and this is how you do this, and then the next day okay, I can make this video now because now I know this. No, it was a really long learning curve with lots and trials and error, with lots of errors, especially because I was using Arch-based Linux distro, an unstable Linux distro, so I've screwed up my own system more than one time. But again, it was a great learning experience. So I've thrown myself into the cold water, you could say. And again, you know, music production on Linux is a great, amazing tool, but what really shows, especially when you're in regards of Yabridge, for example, what am I talking about? Now, you have Wine. Wine is a program which allows you to run Windows audio plugins inside Linux. I mean, it's actually the most well-known Linux plugin program in existence, I think. But again, then you have Proton, for example. Proton is used by game developers, by Valve, for example, to make it possible to run Windows video games inside SteamOS, for example, your Steam Deck. This is what all of them are using Proton. And its drastic increase in the market share is definitely thanks to Valve, with Proton, for example, and the compatibility widening thereby. But on the other hand, in music production, for example, you have Yabridge. I mean, you cannot compare Yabridge and Proton because they are two entirely different programs that do entirely different things. But, you know, it's a program which allows you to run Windows audio plugins inside a Linux store, or Linux Reaper, for example. And it really shows that there is not this big of a background funding for Yabridge than there is for Proton, for example. Which is kind of sad because, again, I think the Proton program is an amazing tool and that it is possible at all to work with Windows audio plugins inside Reaper, especially in a lower latency. And so thereby, you know, you need to fill around lots with it, for example, you know, downgrading the Wine version. This is why I use DistroBox containers and with separate home directives, because so that I'm able to install two different Wine versions in parallel without them overriding each other. Things you can do inside Linux are amazing. The options you do have are also amazing. The amount of modifications you can do is immense. The problem is being, first of all, NVIDIA GPU drivers, but more proper to this topic is there are documentations for everything you can do, but they are not easy to find for a beginner, I mean. And if you're completely confused and do not know where to start, then it can become extremely overwhelming. So Linux really does you give the freedom, but you are doomed to be free. That's kind of as philosophic as my channel is going to get. I've also talked about QPV graph, for example, GUI interface, a Flatpak, unimportant. For it you can also use Helvum, etc. But that's it's unimportant right now. But again, yeah. And all of these steps were more of a preparational nature. So I did not do any music recording at all, actually. It was just, you know, setting up your computer, preparing your computer, etc. Because in the next videos I'm going more into audio production, audio recording, setups, tutorials, etc. Behaviors of the system, of the DAW, etc. in specific cases. Thanks for watching this video. I hope it was kinda interesting, helpful. Check out my playlist. Maybe you will find something that you might have needed. Or not, maybe. Yeah. Keep working, because there's still much to do, and go read Berserk.